And as promised, today's guest is Michael Sandman, town meeting member from Precinct 3 and the most recent former chair of the advisory committee. And we're going to talk about the November-December town meeting. Of course, as you can imagine, there's quite a few warrant articles. I don't remember. Let's see here, roughly 32. We're not going to talk about all of them, not because they're not all important, but because they're not all that interesting for television. And that's okay. Sometimes business is just business. But there are some articles we're going to talk about that I'm really excited, both for you, the viewer here on Brookline Interactive Group, to get a feel for what's happening and learn something, but also kind of share what's interesting about them. Not all of these were close votes. Not all of these were especially controversial, but I think there was something interesting about all of them that makes them worth talking about. And I actually want to get started with the second special town meeting. And that was a one warrant article town meeting, and that was some budget items, and included in that was budget items related to the indemnification of town meeting member and former advisory committee member Stanley Spiegel. Mike, thanks for being on the show. Let's dive right in. Tell us about sort of what the issue was that we were trying to figure out here.
Sure. Thanks, Tommy. The issue was that Stanley Spiegel was named as one of the respondents in a lawsuit that was filed on behalf of Gerald Alston because Stanley had made some comments to some people about the case, and according to the people who heard him, he expressed the view that he knew things that they didn't, perhaps because he was a member of the advisory committee. And Stanley disputes that, but since I wasn't there, I can't tell you what was said. In any case, he was pulled into the case, and the town council is responsible for deciding whether or not to provide legal services to somebody who would be otherwise entitled to indemnification, or who's entitled to defense because they're a public official. And she decided initially that Stanley didn't fit that description, although the select board members who made decisions related to Gerald Alston certainly did, and some other individuals in the town, on town staff did as well. So Stanley had to go out and get his own legal counsel, and he succeeded in getting himself dismissed from the case. And then he had to succeed in getting himself dismissed again, because the complaint came, even though the complaint was initially dismissed by the judge, the complaint about him came back a second time. And so he spent some significant amount of money on getting legal counsel and getting the motions for dismissal put together and the research done in back of them and so forth. And his attorney, as Marty Rosenthal, presented a claim for $198,090, and the initial claim was put into a warrant article as part of the budget by the advisory committee. Actually, Marty introduced a separate warrant article, but the advisory committee wanted to put this into the budget article where we felt it belonged. And our concern was that we were being asked to spend a big chunk of money without much or really any documentation. And so we had a series of conversations back and forth with Marty and with some other folks, and ended up suggesting that an independent reviewer, should take a look at all of the invoices, all of the bills, and see whether the charges were reasonable and whether the work that was done was specific to the case, to the situation. Was there something else that was being done at the same time? And it's just a reasonable way of making sure that if we indemnify Stanley, that we're indemnifying him for what the town should be covered.
So a bit of auditing to make sure that the expenses submitted were appropriate, both spent thoughtfully, but also on the right matter. Is there any chance that is this a one-off, or is there a bigger policy at play here with this issue?
That's a very good question. There is a bigger policy And it's one of the things that I think at least some town meeting members were sensitive to, and I know a lot of the advisory committee members were sensitive to. Stanley was pulled into the case by virtue of his service to the town. And there are hundreds of volunteers who do things on behalf of the town. And if one of them says something that results or does something that results in they being dragged into a legal dispute, will the town defend them? And will the town help them out? And subsequently, by the way, town council changed their mind about including Stanley. And then, but at that point, Stanley had already retained counsel and basically had spent the money. So the question is there a precedent here? Yes, there is a precedent, and it relates to how broadly the indemnification that the town is prepared to make, or how broadly the town's defense of someone is prepared to go. And it does cement in place a policy that actually existed in writing, but hadn't really been tested.
And ultimately, town meeting voted 195 to 25 in favor, about 88%, far more than the simple majority that would have been necessary. And we're going to move on because we got to, keep our viewers engaged and be respectful of the show that comes on after us. So I want to sort of skip to Articles 7, 8, and 9, and they're different details, but they're all related to retail marijuana sales in the town of Brookline. So to remind you, Article 7 would have increased the cap on marijuana retailers by 2 for equity applicants. Article 8 sought to round down the number of licenses when you do the division and you get a fraction. And Article 9 related to a study for the town's approach to recreational marijuana. And we debated them all at once, which can feel a little bit complicated, but maybe more efficient than doing them all separately. What were your takeaways? What was actually interesting and important, and what maybe we went through the motions on, but isn't going to be very defining? What are people going to remember 6 months from now?
Well, that's one thing they're going to remember, is that it was a very long debate because there were quite a number of people who spoke in favor of rounding down the number of licenses, even though it wouldn't have any immediate impact in the town in terms of the number of licenses that have been issued. 4 licenses have been issued for marijuana. They call dispensaries, as they're called. They're really marijuana stores. And the thing that I take away from it is that town meeting as a whole wants to see what happens with retail marijuana before it makes any changes at all, before it increases the number of licenses, or before it takes any steps to decrease the number of licenses that could potentially be issued. We can potentially issue 1 license for every 2 package stores, I believe, and off-premises liquor license stores. And if we, sorry, I beg your pardon, 1 for every 4. And if we issue another couple of liquor licenses for some reason, the number of licenses for marijuana will go up from 4 to 5. And the people who wanted to round down were determined that they wanted to prevent that. Everybody, so the consensus seems to be, let's just see what happens.
Yeah, so in fact, you're referring to Article 8,
yeah,
right? And Article 8, I'm checking, right, failed 106 to 116, very close. It was sort of it sort of tells me that town meeting is roughly like 50-50 on press ahead versus tone it back. And I think, not stay the same, but actually sort of, pull it back a little bit. So I think your assessment is right. I want to quickly talk about Article 7, equity applicants. The idea was to create 2 more licenses specifically for equity applicants. That ultimately was referred. In other words, the vote wasn't a no vote, but town meeting decided, let's study that and bring it back later. And I know, Michael, you know this. I'm helping some of the viewers who aren't town meeting parliamentarians stay aboard. So it's not a no vote, but it's decidedly not a yes vote. And so the motion to refer was quite overwhelming, 157 to 69. What was the idea behind equity applicants, and why do you think town meeting said we're not there yet?
So it's pretty clear as marijuana licenses have been issued really all across the state that there was an intent when retail marijuana was legalized to try to give members of minority communities, especially the African American community, an opportunity to participate in an industry that when it was illegal in Massachusetts resulted in large numbers of African Americans being charged with a crime for possession of marijuana. And an awful lot of, there was a substantial tilt in the direction of stronger, a more rigorous enforcement of the law when it came to African Americans than it was for other citizens or other residents. So the intent was, well, let's see if we can do something that will help minority applicants. And that really didn't happen. I think there's one licensee in Boston that's controlled by minority owners, but didn't happen. It didn't happen in Brookline. Fairly well-capitalized organizations have taken over the retail marijuana industry, not just in Massachusetts. And so the thought was that by the proponents of that article, that we should offer 2 licenses specifically to people who are from minority communities.
2 additional licenses above and beyond the 4 that have already been issued.
Exactly. Thank you. And the difficulty with that is, well, how do you define that? How do you ensure that that a business really is controlled by members of a minority? That's probably the basis of the referral rather than saying yes or no. Let's take another look at this. The state has some definitions. Is this practical? Can we do it on a town at a town level without waiting for action from the state? And I think that's what happened with 7. And with 9, the proposal was to set up a separate moderators committee from an additional committee to study retail marijuana. There's already a committee looking at retail marijuana, and the feeling in town meeting was, well, let's give this to the committee that's already studying it.
Carlo Guthrie mentioned 1 large pile better than 2 small piles. Rather than bring that one up, we threw ours down, right? That's an obscure reference, and about 3 weeks late. Thanksgiving just passed. We're going to move on because we don't have a lot of time. And I want to talk quickly about Article 19, which was a nuisance control noise bylaw issue that didn't rise to be the most sort of important or meaningful warrant article, but in fact, the vote was really close. So I think it's interesting. So tell us a little bit about amending Article 8.29 of the town's general bylaws for nuisance control.
So the issue that was presented was that with restaurants having outdoor dining, there could be parties, or people could be loud, and where a lot of restaurants are in neighborhoods where there's mixed commercial and residential, and they could be disturbing residents late at night by having restaurant operations, especially in a situation where people have access to alcohol outside. The question is that a real concern? There's a lot of support for restaurant owners in town. They're an important element in the life of the town. On the one hand, on the other hand, the proponents made a strong case, as strong as they could anyway, to support the idea that there should be some control over the noise. And ultimately, people were sort of torn. Do we want to do something that limits the restaurant's ability to operate in this way? Is it really a problem, or should we be doing something about it?
And so it failed by a vote of 91 to 122, which is, it's close in town meeting. It's rare we see votes that close. And of course, there remain other tools at the disposal of the town. If there is a particularly loud problem, right, a resident can still call the police and can still, police officer come over and say, hey guys, like, you're at a 10, you need to be at a 2, right? So it's not as if we have to fear really loud problems indefinitely. And it sounds like, raise the point. I suspect business owners now going to be a little bit more careful, right? Make sure, hey guys, like let's bring it down a notch from time to time. And I think that's helpful. I want to get to warrant article 22, which was not close. So the opposite, warrant article 22 zoned for the siting of firearms businesses, right? Gun stores. So we said we would like to pass a bylaw about gun stores, a zoning bylaw about gun stores, and that passed by a vote of 214-1. So tell us what we did, because it's not obvious at all from the title what we did.
Okay, well, it'd be interesting to talk to the one person who voted against it, but
I did that last week, and it was interesting.
I'll
but
bet.
That's for a different television show.
Newton, there was an empty storefront in Newton about, I don't know, a year ago or so, and the owner of the property was approached by somebody who was thinking about opening a store, and he decided that maybe he would open a gun store, a store for firearms. And there was a great deal of opposition in Newton to that, and from that, Newton developed a bylaw, and that was the sort of impetus for doing the same thing in Brookline, out of concern that someone would come along and put a gun store in an empty storefront in Brookline. So one thing is very important to recognize, which is the gun lobby nationally is very sensitive about any restrictions on the ability for people to obtain arms. And there was concern that if we simply outlawed all gun stores everywhere in town, we would attract a lawsuit that would be expensive to defend, and we might lose anyway. So the decision was made to limit where gun stores could be by requiring that they not be within 1,000 feet of the school. I think it's 100 feet of a child of a preschool or adjacent to a residence, and that limited them to 4 or 5 storefronts in Coolidge Corner and an empty parking lot in Chestnut Hill. So at least in theory, there's a place to put a gun store if you are really determined to do that. And in fact, it would be very difficult to do that because the number of properties that are available right now is 0. So that passed really pretty easily.
And I would add that the numbers chosen, 1,000 feet, the 100 feet, right, the sort of restrictions weren't pulled out of thin air. And they weren't designed specifically to like create overlapping circles of prohibition. In fact, maybe you could tell us a little bit where those numbers came from.
Yeah, just the opposite, actually. Especially the initial idea was to say, well, other sorts of stores, marijuana stores, for example, can't be within a certain distance of schools and preschools and so forth. And the initial idea was to make the restriction for preschools to 500 feet, but that would have made the entire town off limits because there were a lot of preschools around. And so the proponents kept running little concentric circles out, on their GIS mapping systems to figure out that 100 feet was really the maximum, the minimum that the maximum that they could set that restriction at. So there was a lot of thought that went into this. It was an interesting process to watch.
And in fact, some of the other distances are based on other state or federal laws with the identical distance, right? And so it wasn't.
Yeah, the 1,000-foot school limit is very common.
Right. Yeah. So like I said, it passed overwhelmingly. And what I want to sort of just throw out there is how pre-existing non-conforming played into the conversation and why the petitioners felt it was critical that we do this immediately and not wait. So maybe you could just take a minute and explain that.
Sure. So what they were concerned about was that in the absence of any kind of control, a retail business like a gun store could open in any commercial zone without any restriction on it. And once that happened, it would be in existence, and a zoning change would not apply to that store. So it could be anywhere in Coolidge Corner, Washington Square, and JFK Crossing, wherever. So by doing it this way, ahead of time, ahead of the curve, so to speak, in anticipation of a problem, which is kind of unusual in zoning. Usually we wait until a problem occurs, and then we try and fix the zoning. But in this case, it was sort of fixed, if you're assuming your attitude is the same as town meetings was, by looking ahead.
Thank you. We're going to skip to 28 and go back to 26. We don't have a lot of time left, so I'm really just going to give like what I would call an honorable mention to Article 28. Warrant Article 28 regulates trade in fur products. Sort of the way to think about it is it prohibits the retail sale of fur clothing. To keep it sort of simple, what I thought was really interesting about this article is two things. Number one, it was filed or it was sort of driven, the effort and the idea was driven by a 14-year-old student named Ezra Kleinbaum, and that a 14-year-old wants to do anything related to civic life is pretty remarkable. But town meeting has seen high schoolers do warrant articles before. What I will say that I found most remarkable about the work of Ezra Kleinbaum is that he did the work. In fact, if one sort of copied down all of the things he did in preparation for town meeting starting in the spring, one could give that out, in my view, as a handbook for town meeting members on how you ought to do a successful warrant article. He met with people early. He found out the other towns that had it and copied their language to make it fit for Brookline, but be able to show that other communities had done it. He really did the work, and it's a real credit to this young man. And so we don't have a lot of time to talk about the outcome. By the way, there were no stores at the moment selling these products, and so this is similar to the gun store warrant article, sort of heading off a future circumstance. And it didn't pass unanimously. I see Michael kind of wincing a little bit, but it passed overwhelmingly. But what I do want to do, because we don't have too much time left, is get to warrant article 26. And that was a really interesting outcome if you care about process, and a guy like me certainly does.
Okay, so this is really, 26 is probably the most important article that passed in town meeting, because it sets us on a path to redoing the zoning bylaw. And the zoning bylaw that we have goes back, 40 or 50 years, and it's one modification after another has been piled onto it to the point where it's unpredictable. If you want to build something in Brookline, it's very difficult to build something by right because the rules are so restrictive, especially commercial properties. And the outcome, if you have to go for a special permit, is very, very hard to predict. So looking at the city of Somerville's process in which the planning department engaged the entire community, neighborhood by neighborhood, and said to them, what do you want? What do you want buildings to look like? Where do you want them to be built? And the process that resulted from that was sufficiently clear, surprisingly enough. When citizens all get together, they coalesced around a set of ideas that that the city of Somerville was able to come up with a completely new, brand new zoning bylaw, which relies on a different principle that I won't take the time to go into it, but it's called form-based zoning. The article will lead us in the direction of emulating Somerville, I guess it is. And the problem that we have is Brookline. A lot of people think that Brookline is a rich town, and it is. In terms of our real estate values, it certainly is, and in terms of our per capita income. But our municipal taxes are almost totally based on residential properties. And unlike Somerville, Boston, Cambridge, which have very substantial commercial tax bases, it's almost impossible to build anything commercially in Brookline because of the zoning bylaw. And so hopefully we will come to terms with the need to have more defined commercial opportunities in town, along with knowing where we can build multifamily housing and mixed commercial residential. So this is an important one, and it's going to take a few years to play out. but it's a really great start down that road.
Now, when the article was first filed, that's not the article that town meeting ultimately passed. Can you kind of
Right.
give us a flavor for how it started and how it's going and how we got there in this particular case, which I think have lessons for town meeting for future warrant articles?
Indeed, they do. So it really started with a presentation to the advisory committee of what Somerville had done, because we understood that Somerville had done something interesting, and we asked for, we had a 2-hour meeting with a presentation from a city planner from Somerville. And that got some people thinking about, well, what can we do in Brookline? And a warrant article began to take form. As the warrant article was initially presented, it was sort of hell-bent for election on rezoning, and there was no careful, thoughtful process to get to that point and to enlist resident support. So there were a lot of people, particularly people who are very concerned about affordable housing, who said, well, this is just a way of stopping progress in building affordable housing. Actually, and I sat down with some of those folks in the summertime. I said, you know, nobody's going to get what they want with the current zoning bylaw, not you and not anybody else. And it would be much better to sit down and say, well, what do you want? And what are you willing to do along the lines of rezoning? One thing was very clearly that they would not be willing to stop bringing in new zoning bylaws themselves, and that's reasonable. Until there's something else, well, they have to operate under the current law. And to their credit, they were very thoughtful and ended up supporting the article. So it passed by a substantial majority.
Well, town meeting goes on for tens of hours. TV on TV is only 25 minutes. Well, 30 minutes, including the intro. And so we're out of time. Michael, thank you so much for coming on the show, and really for investing all the time prior to the show, working on behalf of the town in this volunteer fashion, having served as chair of the advisory committee, really getting to know each and every article, as well as budget issues and other issues, and putting in the work to develop the expertise and bring to it the patience and the thoughtfulness necessary. And so speaking for myself, and I think for the town, very grateful for all of your efforts thus far, and hope you will continue to find ways to work on our behalf in the town of Brookline. You've been watching TV on TV. I'm Tommy Vitolo. Brookline Interactive Group is our thoughtful host. Mike, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.